Have you ever had that really disorienting experience where you learn a completely new, totally obscure word? Something you could swear you have never ever encountered in your entire life.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Right. And then suddenly, within the next 24 hours, that exact word is in some article you're reading. Then someone casually drops it in a meeting, and then you hear it in passing at a coffee shop.
It's uncanny, honestly.
It really is. Or, maybe you decide to buy a very specific make and color of a car. Let's say a bright yellow hatchback.
Okay, yellow hatchback.
Yeah, you buy it and you're assuming, I'll be driving a relatively unique vehicle. But the second you pull off the dealer lot, you suddenly notice that exact yellow hatchback haunting every single intersection, every highway, every parking lot you visit.
Like they all just spawned in at once.
Yes, exactly. It feels almost supernatural, like the physics engine of your reality is glitching, or someone is just playing this highly coordinated statistical joke on you.
It really is a universally recognizable feeling. And the sensation of that sudden ubiquity, it's just profound. The environment feels as though it has been instantly repopulated with this specific item.
Right, but it hasn't, right?
No, not at all. I mean, the physical environment hasn't been altered one bit,
Yeah.
but the architecture of your perception absolutely has.
And that cognitive architecture is exactly what we are decoding today, because this deep dive is entirely dedicated to unveiling how the human brain actively engineers these patterns.
Turning random statistics into seemingly magical coincidences.
Exactly. So we're going to explore the underlying neurobiology of these cognitive filters that curate your physical reality. We'll examine the hard neuroscience driving the aha moment.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
It really is. We'll look at the specific brainwave frequencies that correlate with sudden insight and how understanding these deeply ingrained mental systems can actually allow you to learn faster, increase your creative output, and literally alter your baseline perception of the world around you.
And to construct this picture, we are integrating a really diverse stack of source material today.
Yeah, we have a lot to cover.
We do. We will be analyzing cutting-edge neuroimaging data published in Neuroimage and Quantum Magazine, and we'll be cross-referencing that with foundational cognitive psychology textbooks.
Plus some really interesting medical case studies from academic radiology.
Right. And we'll also look at the historical, linguistic origins of how we even categorize this phenomenon. Oh, and we will definitely dissect the strategic playbooks from marketing intelligence labs.
Ah, yes. The people who actively weaponize this cognitive glitch to sell us things.
Exactly. It's a packed deep dive.
It is. So establishing a baseline definition is probably the best place to start before we get completely lost in functional magnetic resonance imaging and neural pathways.
That's a good idea.
So for anyone listening who is trying to put a pin in exactly what we are discussing, how does the scientific literature actually classify this sudden onset of noticing things?
Well, in cognitive psychology and linguistics, it is formally termed the frequency illusion.
Frequency illusion, okay.
Yeah. The working definition is basically that it's a cognitive bias where immediately following the acquisition of new information or maybe the assignment of value to a novel stimulus, an individual perceives a massive spike in the frequency of that stimulus in their environment.
So you notice it a lot more.
Right. But the defining characteristic, the really important part, is that the actual objective frequency of the object or word in the real world remains completely static. It hasn't changed at all.
Just your perception of it.
Exactly. The only variable that has skyrocketed is your perceptual sensitivity to it.
So those yellow hatchbacks were sitting at those intersections all along. My visual cortex was processing them, but my conscious awareness was totally discarding them.
Yep. They were categorized as irrelevant environmental noise.
Which makes sense functionally. I mean, we'd go crazy otherwise. But before we look at the cellular mechanisms of how the brain switches that noise into a signal, we do need to address the nomenclature.
Ah, the name. Yes.
Because while frequency illusion is the clinical term, anyone who has spent any time on early internet forums knows this by a much more geopolitically charged name, which is the Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon.
It definitely does not sound like a standard psychological condition.
Not at all. So where did that come from?
Well, the etymology of that phrase is just a fascinating case study in early internet virality intersecting with human psychology.
Because it's from the 90s, right?
Yeah, the origin dates back to 1994, and it actually has absolutely no connection to clinical research.
Wow. Okay.
So a reader named Terry Mullen wrote a letter to the discussion board of the St. Paul Pioneer Press in Minnesota. And in his letter, Mullen described a personal experience where he had recently been discussing the Baader-Meinhof gang.
And just for the sake of historical context here, and relying strictly on the documentation in our sources, the Baader-Meinhof gang, which was also known as the Red Army faction, was a militant, radical, left-wing organization operating in West Germany throughout the 1970s.
Right. And it's really necessary for us to state clearly right now that we are maintaining a strictly neutral, impartial stance regarding the historically violent and politically charged nature of that group.
Absolutely. We are not taking sides or endorsing anything.
Now, we are bringing it up solely to trace the etymology of the psychological term as it is outlined in our source material, without endorsing or validating any viewpoints of the group itself.
Exactly. We just have to explain where the weird name came from. So Carrie Mullen, living in Minnesota in the mid-90s, happens to bring up this specific West German militant group in a random conversation.
Yes. And then, within 24 hours of that initial conversation, he encounters a completely unrelated reference to the Baader-Meinhof gang in his daily news consumption.
Which is a pretty wild coincidence.
It's striking enough that he wrote to the newspaper about it, and he casually coined his experience the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon.
And the phrase just caught on.
It exploded because it perfectly encapsulated an experience everyone has, but literally nobody had a word for.
Right. You read that and go, oh my gosh, that happens to me all the time.
Exactly. The early internet message boards acted as this massive accelerator. Hundreds of people replied with their own identical experiences, learning obscure historical facts or new words only to see them everywhere the very next day.
So the term just embedded itself in the culture.
It really did. And it wasn't until a decade later, around 2005 or 2006, that Arnold Zwicky, who is a linguistics professor at Stanford University, published commentary formally branding it the frequency illusion.
To give it an actual scientific framework.
Exactly. He wanted a descriptive scientific name for it.
Well, to ground Zwicky's framework in a more modern context, our sources highlight a highly relatable narrative involving someone named Carly Leonard.
Yes, who is actually an assistant professor of psychology specializing in human attention and memory.
Which makes this story kind of ironic.
It really does.
Right.
Her experience is the perfect real-world analog for the mechanics we are about to discuss.
Right. So she goes out and purchases a new purple jacket. And in her mind, she's making this distinct, somewhat unconventional sartorial choice.
Because, purple isn't the most common color for outerwear.
Exactly. So she assumes she will stand out. But the moment she leaves the store and integrates back into the city environment, she is just inundated with purple jackets.
They're everywhere.
Everywhere. She sees them on pedestrians, draped over chairs in cafes, passing by on bicycles, and despite being a cognitive psychologist who studies this exact mechanism for a living, the subjective power of the illusion actually makes her question reality.
She literally finds herself wondering if there was some sudden coordinated shift in fashion trends that she somehow completely missed.
The feeling of a coordinated coincidence.
Yeah, that is the behavioral hallmark of the frequency illusion. Your brain attempts to rationalize this sudden influx of data by assuming the world has changed, rather than accepting that its own internal filtering mechanisms have shifted.
The best analogy I can think of for this feeling is the structure of those massive open-world video games.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right, like you spend 50 hours playing, and the environment is populated by standard repetitive elements. Regular cars, regular people. Then you finally complete a quest that unlocks, say, a rare vehicle or a new character class.
And suddenly,
that rare vehicle is parked on literally every digital street corner, and that new character is in every cutscene. The underlying code of the game's environment didn't undergo an update while you were playing.
No, the assets were always being rendered in the background.
Exactly. The only thing that changed was your specific level of access to those assets. Your new awareness triggered the rendering.
That is a remarkably accurate conceptual map for human cognition, actually. What we are observing in Carly Leonard's experience, or your video game analogy, is the sudden transmutation of noise into signal.
Noise to signal.
Yeah. The visual data of purple jackets or the auditory data of an obscure word, it constantly bombards our sensory organs.
Yeah.
But the brain must rigorously classify the vast majority of that data as irrelevant background noise. Otherwise, it couldn't function.
So the epiphany here isn't that the world magically reorganized itself around your new jacket?
No, the epiphany is realizing the sheer magnitude of the sensory data your brain is actively hiding from you every single second of the day.
You're not interacting with an objective baseline reality at all. You are interacting with a curated feed of reality.
A highly edited feed, yes.
So if we look under the hood here, how is the brain mechanically executing this filter? The sources point to two distinct cognitive processes operating in tandem, right?
That's right. The illusion is a two-phase mechanical operation. And the first pillar is selective attention, which is heavily mediated by a network of neurons in the brainstem known as the reticular activating system, or the RAS.
The RAS. Okay, so in basic cognitive models, the RAS is often introduced as a sort of bouncer for the conscious mind.
Right, the bouncer analogy.
Yeah, like it's standing at the door of your cortex with a VIP list, deciding which sensory inputs get to enter your awareness and which are left out in the cold. But biologically, what is the actual mechanism at play here? How does a pencil-sized cluster of neurons in the brainstem govern what I see on a highway?
Well, the bouncer analogy works conceptually, but the biology is far more elegant. The RAS is part of the ascending reticular activating system. It receives input from visceral, somatic, and sensory systems.
Basically every sense, right?
Almost every sense, except olfaction or smell. But yeah, when you are exposed to billions of bits of sensory information, processing all of it consciously would result in immediate metabolic exhaustion.
You just crash cognitive paralysis.
Exactly. So to prevent this, the RAS modulates the thalamocortical pathways. It utilizes neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and acetylcholine to physically depolarize specific neurons.
What does that mean, practically speaking?
It means it effectively lowers the threshold for excitability in targeted areas of your cortex.
Oh, wow. So it physically changes how sensitive my visual cortex is to, say, a specific wavelength of light, like the yellow of that hatchback.
Yes, exactly. When you buy the car, you assign it high valence. You signal to your brain that this object has newly acquired relevance to your life. So the RAS updates its filtering criteria.
It updates the VIP list.
Yep. So the next time your optic nerve takes in a busy intersection, the RAS, which previously dampened the signal of yellow cars, now amplifies it. It allows that specific visual data to bypass the thalamic gate and enter your conscious working memory.
Okay, but wait. If the RAS is constantly updating based on what we learn, why don't we experience the frequency illusion for literally everything we encounter?
What do you mean?
Like, I could sit down and read a dictionary for an hour, exposing myself to hundreds of new words, but I don't walk outside and suddenly see all 500 of those words plastered on billboards.
Well,
What is the threshold for the RAS to actually care enough to alter its filter?
that is a critical distinction to make. Mere exposure is not enough to reprogram the RAS. The threshold requires the assignment of personal value, emotional resonance, or active engagement. Reading a dictionary is passive. But if you stumble across a new word while you're struggling to write a really important email, or maybe a colleague uses a word that makes you feel slightly uneducated,
Oh, yeah. Then you care.
exactly, you attach an emotional valence to it. That emotional tag, which is often mediated by the amygdala interacting with the RAS, is what forces the system to actually update the filter.
That makes perfect sense. It requires a stake in the game. Okay, so the RAS amplifies the signal, allowing the purple jacket or the new word to breach conscious awareness. But noticing something a few times doesn't fully explain that eerie, matrix glitching sensation of the frequency illusion.
No, it doesn't.
And that brings us to the second pillar, confirmation bias.
Right. Once the RAS permits the novel information to surface, confirmation bias takes over the narrative framing.
And just to define it, confirmation bias is the well-documented cognitive mechanism where humans actively seek out, interpret, and selectively recall information that validates our pre-existing hypotheses.
While simultaneously ignoring or aggressively discounting any data that contradicts them.
Okay, let's track this sequentially for the listener. You learn the word serendipity on a Tuesday, and you attach a high valence to it because you thought it sounded beautiful.
Okay, so the VIP list is updated.
Right. Then on Wednesday, your RAS lets the word slip through the filter while you're reading a magazine. Now, your brain immediately forms a subconscious hypothesis.
It formulates the idea. This word is experiencing a sudden surge in cultural usage. It establishes a new belief.
Everyone is using serendipity now.
Exactly. And from that exact moment on, confirmation bias skews your internal statistical modeling. Every subsequent encounter with the word serendipity is actively logged by your brain as hard evidence supporting your hypothesis.
It's counting the hits.
Yes.
But it is completely ignoring the misses. I mean, it doesn't log the millions of other words you read that day. It doesn't factor in the thousands of hours of conversation where the word was never spoken. It throws out the massive baseline of negative data.
It creates a severe sampling error. Selective attention physically finds the data points, and confirmation bias actively structures those points into a false narrative of ubiquity.
When you break it down like that, this mechanism seems incredibly flawed.
It does feel that way, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, if the human brain is the apex result of millions of years of rigorous evolutionary pressure, why would we retain a cognitive architecture that systematically lies to us about environmental statistics? Why are we biologically hardwired to generate false illusions of frequency?
Well, it's because evolutionary biology does not prioritize statistical accuracy.
What does it prioritize?
It prioritizes survival and reproduction. This cognitive bias is not a glitch. It is a highly conserved evolutionary feature. In the literature of evolutionary psychology, this is explained through error management theory.
Also frequently referred to as the smoke detector principle, right?
Exactly, the smoke detector principle.
The premise being that you want your smoke detector to be overly sensitive.
Right. Consider the asymmetric cost of errors. If you tune a smoke detector to be highly sensitive, it will occasionally trigger a false positive. It goes off when you merely burn a piece of toast.
Which is annoying.
It is. The cost of that error is mild annoyance. However, if you tune it to be less sensitive to avoid those false positives, you risk a false negative.
Meaning the detector remains silent while the house burns down.
Exactly. The cost of that error is catastrophic.
Okay, applying that to a hunter-gatherer context, pattern recognition is literally a matter of life and death.
For an early hominid, the environment is full of ambiguous sensory data. You hear a rustling in the tall grass. Your brain must instantly decide if it's the wind or a stalking predator.
Right.
If your brain aggressively connects the dots and perceives the pattern of a predator, you run. If it was a false positive, just the wind, the metabolic cost is simply the calories expended by running away.
But if your brain fails to recognize the pattern,
False negative.
and it is a predator, you are removed from the gene pool.
Precisely. We are the descendants of the hominids who possessed hyperactive pattern recognition engines. The paranoid ones survived to pass down their RAS architecture.
That is wild. We are biologically mandated to overperceive patterns. We will connect unrelated data points to form a cohesive picture because nature determined that hallucinating a pattern that isn't there is infinitely safer than ignoring a pattern that poses a threat.
Exactly. And this fundamental drive to pull patterns out of the noise isn't just a survival tactic for dodging predators. It is the bedrock of human intelligence.
The ability to synthesize disparate pieces of information into a cohesive whole, that is the very definition of an aha moment.
It is.
So how do we transition from the behavioral illusion of frequency to the hard neuroscience of insight? Like, what is physically happening in the neural circuitry when a confusing set of data points suddenly snaps into absolute clarity?
Well, the transition from confusion to insight is actually one of the most rigorously studied phenomena in modern neuroscience. And it is not a linear, gradual warming up of the brain.
It's not like turning up a dimmer switch.
No, not at all. It is an explosive, non-linear phase shift. To map this out, researchers often begin with the foundational 1926 Wallace model of insight.
1926? That's an old model.
It is, but it's incredibly robust. It segments the process of insight into 4 distinct stages.
Okay, let's dissect the Wallace model. Stage 1 is preparation.
Right. Preparation is the period of conscious, deliberate, and highly analytical focus.
So grinding away at a problem.
Exactly. If you are staring at a complex mathematical equation, or you're trying to recall a specific name that's on the tip of your tongue, you are in the preparation phase. You are actively deploying your prefrontal cortex, utilizing step-by-step logic and working memory.
But if it's a really hard problem, that doesn't always work.
No. In scenarios requiring true insight, this linear approach eventually exhausts itself. You hit a cognitive impasse.
You get stuck, which initiates stage 2,
Yeah.
incubation.
Yes, incubation. And this phase requires you to cease conscious analytical effort. You have to walk away from the desk, you take a shower, you go for a run.
We just give up for a minute.
Consciously, yes. But the cessation of conscious effort does not mean neural activity has stopped. During incubation, the brain shifts the problem to unconscious processing networks.
It's running in the background.
It begins quietly exploring broad, distant associative pathways, completely without the strict constraints of your conscious logic.
Then, seemingly out of nowhere, you're, I don't know, tying your shoes, and stage 3 hits. Illumination. The breakthrough.
The aha moment. The unconscious network finally finds the associative link, and the solution forcefully breaches the threshold of conscious awareness.
It just pops into your head.
Exactly. And this is followed immediately by stage 4, verification, where your conscious analytical mind takes back control.
Just to test it and make sure it actually works.
Right, to test the newly surfaced solution against logical constraints to ensure it is actually viable.
So the 1926 model is a brilliant psychological framework. But what makes the current research we're looking at so compelling is that we no longer have to rely solely on behavioral observations.
We can actually look inside the brain.
Right. We can place subjects in fMRI and EEG machines and watch the biological mechanics of the Wallace model play out in real time. We can visualize the battle of the brainwaves.
It's incredible. The neuroimaging data, particularly from studies published in Neuroimage, reveals a stark contrast in neural oscillation depending on which phase of the Wallace model you are currently in.
And it is fundamentally a shift between alpha waves and gamma waves.
Yes. During the preparation phase, when you are grinding through a problem analytically, the EEG shows high power in the posterior alpha band, oscillating at roughly 8 to 12 hertz.
And alpha waves are essentially the signature of the brain actively suppressing distracting visual inputs, right? Like trying to maintain intense, internally directed focus.
Exactly. You're blocking out the world to focus on the math problem. But the moment of illumination looks entirely different on the scan.
What happens?
When an insight occurs, the EEG detects this explosive bursts of high-frequency gamma waves, oscillating between 30 and 50 hertz.
That is a massive escalation in neural frequency.
It's a huge spike.
Where exactly is this gamma burst localized in the brain?
The fMRI data localizes this burst to the right anterior superior temporal gyrus, or the RATL.
The RATL, okay.
Yeah. The right hemisphere, generally speaking, is really adept at processing broad, overlapping, and distantly related semantic associations. And the RATL is a critical hub for semantic integration.
So it's the area of the brain that allows you to understand a complex metaphor or why a pun is funny?
Yes.
Because it connects two concepts that logic dictates shouldn't really belong together.
Precisely. When a riddle suddenly makes sense, it is because your RATL just fired a gamma burst, instantly linking separate neural assemblies representing those distinct concepts into a single, unified network.
But the brain is highly efficient. I mean, it doesn't just switch from slow, methodical alpha waves to explosive gamma waves at random. There has to be some kind of regulatory mechanism directing traffic.
There is.
What signals the brain that the analytical approach has failed and it's time to trigger an insight?
That regulatory oversight is provided by the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC.
Okay, the ACC. I've often seen it conceptualized as the brain's check engine light.
That's a great way to think about it.
But biologically, how is it detecting that the engine is failing?
Well, the ACC is deeply involved in performance monitoring and conflict detection. When you are stuck in the preparation phase, you are repeatedly deploying analytical strategies that result in failure.
You keep hitting a wall.
Right. And this generates cognitive conflict. Your intended goal is mismatching with your actual output. The ACC detects this specific neurochemical conflict.
It feels the frustration.
Yes. As the frustration mounts, the ACC essentially flags the current top-down analytical strategy as a dead end.
It registers the error state.
And its response to that error state is to trigger a systemic cognitive shift. The ACC signals the prefrontal cortex to relax its rigid, inhibitory control over your thoughts.
Oh, so it drops the blinders.
Exactly. By dropping those cognitive blinders, the ACC allows the quiet, distant associations bubbling up during the incubation phase to actually become perceptible. It primes the semantic network so that the RATL can fire its gamma burst and deliver the solution.
Wow. It is a stunningly complex orchestration.
It really is a symphony of neural activity.
But these oscillating frequencies, alpha and gamma and brain regions like the ACC and RATL, they don't operate in isolation. The newer paradigm in neuroscience looks at massive brain-wide networks.
Right, we're zooming out now.
And our sources indicate that insight and the frequency illusion itself are driven by the interaction of three primary neural networks.
Yes. To understand how a pattern goes from invisible to ubiquitous, we really have to look at network dynamics. The three dominant systems at play are the default mode network, the salience network, and the central executive network.
Okay, let's map these out for you listening. Let's start with the default mode network, or the DMN, because it has become incredibly prominent in cognitive research over the last decade.
It's huge. The DMN is essentially the neural baseline of your internal world. It becomes highly active when your brain is ostensibly at rest, when you are daydreaming, recalling autobiographical memories, or just engaging in unstructured mind wandering.
Staring out the window on a bus.
Exactly. Crucially, the DMN is anti-correlated with externally focused attention. When you start actively solving a math problem, the DMN deactivates.
It shuts down so you can focus.
Right. But during the incubation phase of insight, the DMN is highly active again. It is the playground where subconscious concepts, memories, and distant ideas freely collide without the strict supervision of logic.
So my DMN is actively generating hypothetical solutions in the background while I'm, say, walking my dog.
Yes, exactly.
But how does a valid solution escape the DMN and actually reach my conscious awareness?
That transfer requires the second system, the salience network.
The salience network, okay.
The salience network is anchored in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, our conflict detector we just talked about, and the frontoinsular cortex. Its primary biological function is to act as a dynamic switchboard operator.
What is it monitoring?
It constantly monitors the vast stream of sensory inputs coming from the outside world and the internal stream of DMN activity, scanning for absolutely anything that is biologically or cognitively relevant.
It's looking for salient data.
Exactly. When the salience network detects that the DMN has generated a remote association that perfectly resolves the problem you've been incubating, it immediately flags that neural assembly.
And once it's flagged by the switchboard, where does it go?
The salience network initiates a network switch. It suppresses the DMN and routes that flagged brilliant solution directly to the central executive network, or the CEN.
And what does the CEN do?
The CEN, which is rooted in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is the engine of your conscious, focused attention and working memory. It receives the raw insight, subjects it to the verification phase, and translates it into actionable behavior.
So, just to recap, the daydreaming network generates the idea. The switchboard network recognizes its value, and the executive network implements it.
That is a perfect summary.
This is a beautiful model for creativity. But the core revelation of this deep dive is how this exact tri-network collaboration actively generates the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. Can we connect these macro networks back to the yellow hatchback?
Oh, absolutely. The overlap is direct and mechanical. Consider the relationship between the salience network and the reticular activating system we discussed earlier.
The bouncer.
Right. The salience network is actually what programs the RAS. When you purchase the yellow car or you learn about the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, your salience network tags that specific conceptual representation as highly relevant.
So the VIP list is updated by the salience network.
Yes. Now, as you navigate your day, your visual cortex is processing thousands of cars. Your default mode network might be passively processing your environment while you just listen to the radio.
Zoned out in traffic.
Exactly. But simultaneously, your salience network is running a continuous background scan against its new priority list. The exact millisecond a yellow hatchback enters your peripheral vision, the salience network registers a match.
It spots the VIP.
It instantly interrupts whatever background processing is occurring, seizes control, and shunts that visual data straight into your central executive network.
And boom, the car seemingly materializes out of thin air into your conscious reality.
The collaboration of those networks is the frequency illusion. You have essentially programmed your salience network to run a highly specific extraction algorithm on your environmental data.
You're running a custom search query on your own reality.
That is exactly what you're doing.
And the mechanics are just fascinating. But we really need to address the physiological experience of this process, because when the networks align, the gamma burst fires, and you experience an aha moment or you notice a wild coincidence, it isn't just an emotionally neutral realization.
Not at all.
It comes with a distinct visceral rush. It feels incredibly satisfying. What is the neurochemical basis for that feeling?
Well, the brain ensures that we continue to engage in biologically advantageous behaviors like pattern recognition and problem solving by deeply integrating these cognitive processes with the mesolimbic reward pathway.
Wait, so the same exact circuitry that reinforces like eating calorie-dense foods or getting a dopamine hit from a notification on your phone?
Identical.
Wow.
The researchers publishing a neuroimage utilized high-density EEG to map the precise temporal sequence of an insight. And as we established, the cognitive breakthrough is marked by that high-frequency gamma burst in the right hemisphere.
Right.
But what they discovered next was remarkable. Exactly 100 milliseconds following that initial gamma surge, they recorded a secondary massive surge of neural activity.
This is a 100-millisecond delay. Where is the secondary surge localized?
It illuminates the orbitofrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens.
And what do those do?
The nucleus accumbens is the central hub of the brain's dopaminergic reward system.
Ah, the dopamine.
Yes. When the salience network transfers the solution to the central executive network, and the brain recognizes that a complex pattern has been resolved, The ventral tegmental area dumps a payload of dopamine directly into the nucleus accumbens.
You are quite literally receiving a chemical reward for having an epiphany. We are chemically incentivized to connect the dots.
We are fundamentally addicted to the aha moment. And this biological reality explains a massive swath of human behavioral evolution.
So,
Think about artists, scientists, engineers, and creatives of all types. They are continually chasing this dopaminergic loop. The intense rush of pleasure derived from resolving cognitive tension and connecting distant ideas is what motivates them to endure the agonizing preparation and incubation phases again and again.
it makes the struggle worth it.
Exactly. This neurochemical feedback loop is the primary engine driving human cultural and scientific innovation.
This also deeply clarifies why emotional states are so highly correlated with creativity, doesn't it?
It does. Positive, affective states naturally elevate baseline dopamine levels in the brain. This heightened dopamine tone literally lowers the threshold for the salience network to identify and pass through novel, distant associations generated by the DMN.
So being in a good mood makes you more likely to have an insight.
Yes. Conversely, high anxiety states trigger the release of cortisol and adrenaline, which signals an immediate environmental threat.
And the brain reacts to that threat.
Right. The brain responds by hyperactivating the analytical central executive network and forcefully suppressing the default mode network. Daydreaming, while under threat, is biologically detrimental, so anxiety physically restricts your ability to generate insights.
That makes total sense. I understand the evolutionary benefit of dopamine driving innovation. But dopamine is also heavily associated with feelings of invincibility, overconfidence, and reward-seeking behavior.
It is.
So if experiencing an aha moment floods my prefrontal cortex with dopamine, does that neurochemical state actually compromise my subsequent decision-making? Like, does having an insight make us reckless?
That is a critical behavioral vulnerability that researchers are only just beginning to quantify. And there's a landmark 2024 study by you and colleagues that specifically designed a behavioral paradigm to test this.
What do they do?
They had participants solve complex cognitive puzzles. Some puzzles were solved through slow, methodical analysis, while others were designed to trigger a sudden, dopamine-rich insight.
Okay, so they established two different cognitive states in the subjects.
Right. And immediately after solving a puzzle, the participants were presented with a financial decision. They could either choose a guaranteed safe monetary payout, or they could engage in a high-risk gamble that offered a significantly larger payout, but a high probability of receiving absolutely nothing.
Let me predict the outcome here. The participants who had just experienced the dopamine rush of the insight overwhelmingly chose the high-risk gamble.
The statistical correlation was incredibly robust. Participants who solved the problem via insight exhibited a dramatically higher risk preference compared to those who solved it analytically.
Because of the dopamine.
Yes. The massive dopamine surge from the nucleus accumbens actually alters the valuation algorithms in the prefrontal cortex. It makes uncertain, potential gains appear substantially more attractive while simultaneously minimizing the perceived threat of potential losses.
That is a staggering hidden variable in professional environments.
Huge.
Imagine a day trader or a venture capitalist or a military strategist. They are analyzing complex data sets and suddenly they experience a massive aha moment regarding a market trend or a tactical deployment. They feel brilliant.
They feel invincible.
But their brain is now chemically bathed in dopamine. 5 minutes later, they have to make an execution decision. They believe they are operating on pure, cold logic, but in reality, their neurochemistry is heavily biasing them toward high-risk behavior simply because they just solved a puzzle.
The profound feeling of subjective certainty that accompanies an insight can easily bleed over into entirely unrelated cognitive tasks, temporarily blinding you to risk.
That is a fascinating systemic vulnerability. But let's shift focus to how we can intentionally leverage this neurochemistry. Because the sources indicate that this dopamine hit doesn't solely affect risk preference, it fundamentally alters the mechanics of memory consolidation.
It does.
So if I'm a student or professional attempting to master a dense new skill, how can I hack this biological system to my advantage?
Well, in educational psychology, this phenomenon is quantified as the insight memory advantage. There's a pivotal 2021 study by Danick and Wiley that demonstrated this beautifully.
What did they find?
They found that information acquired through a sudden insight, the classic aha moment, is encoded and retained in long-term memory at a significantly higher rate than information acquired through standard, rote, analytical memorization.
Why? Why does the brain treat an insight differently than a flashcard? What makes the insight inherently stickier?
It comes down to the intensity and distribution of the neural activation. When the gamma burst fires and the dopamine is released, neuroimaging shows massive concurrent activity in the ventral occipitotemporal cortex, or VOTC, and the hippocampus.
And the hippocampus is the core structure for memory consolidation, right?
Right, but it also acts as a sophisticated mismatch detector.
A mismatch between what?
A mismatch between your prior state of ignorance and your new state of comprehension. When a confusing set of variables suddenly snaps into a cohesive pattern, violating your previous inability to understand it, the hippocampus flags this dramatic shift.
It says pay attention to this.
Exactly. The influx of dopamine acts as a chemical fixative, triggering long-term potentiation at the synapses. It essentially burns the new neural pathway into your long-term memory architecture, signaling that this specific pattern is highly valuable for future survival.
So the practical application here is paramount. If you were trying to learn complex neuroanatomy or advanced coding architecture, you can't just brute force your way to an epiphany. You can't command your central executive network to have an insight.
No, brute forcing is biologically counterproductive, because true insight relies on the default mode network to quietly combine disparate concepts. Staring at a textbook for 6 uninterrupted hours guarantees cognitive exhaustion.
You're just spinning your wheels.
You lock the brain into the analytical preparation phase and prevent the incubation phase from ever initiating.
The strategy, then, is intentional disengagement.
Exactly. To master difficult concepts, you must systematically step away from the problem. Engage in behaviors that actively promote DMN activity. Walking in a natural, open environment is highly effective.
Why outside specifically?
Because expanding your peripheral visual field signals safety to the amygdala, which lowers analytical vigilance and allows the DMN to wander. Even more critical is sleep. Sleep architecture provides the ultimate environment for the DMN to freely associate and reorganize the data you acquired during the day.
You literally have to sleep on it.
You must relinquish conscious control to allow the salience network to catch the subconscious connections.
This also provides a really strong biological justification for why the Socratic method of teaching is so effective. The best educators don't just stand at a whiteboard and hand students the final equation.
No. Providing the answer outright bypasses the student's internal conflict and resolution process. Superior educators structure the information, provide the foundational puzzle pieces, and then guide the student to generate the insight internally.
Because that triggers the dopamine.
Yes, the self-generated insight, coupled with the endogenous dopamine release, ensures long-term neural retention that a simple lecture can never achieve.
This pattern recognition engine is clearly a superpower in the context of learning and creative output. But we need to examine the other side of the equation.
The dark side of it.
Yeah. What happens when professionals whose daily decisions have literal life or death consequences are subjected to the frequency illusion? I'm thinking about diagnosticians, emergency room doctors, and criminal investigators. This cognitive bias must present a severe liability.
It is the ultimate double-edged sword in high-stakes professions. The medical literature, specifically case studies from academic radiology, provides an excellent illustration of this.
What's the case?
The sources detail the experience of Kush Purohit, who was a medical student intensely studying radiological anatomy. He was reviewing literature on a specific, relatively rare anatomical variant known as a bovine aortic arch.
And just for context, a bovine aortic arch is a congenital variation where the branching pattern of the major arteries off the heart resembles that of cattle. It's an anatomical quirk.
Right, so he studies this rare variant.
What occurs next?
Within 24 hours of thoroughly reviewing this obscure variant, he identified and diagnosed it on patient scans 3 separate times.
3 times in a day. The statistical probability of 3 patients with this rare variant presenting in a single day is minuscule. But the objective frequency in the hospital population didn't actually spike.
No, his reticular activating system spiked. By studying the variant, he assigned it high clinical valence. His salience network updated the perceptual template in his visual cortex.
Now, in one regard, this is a highly functional adaptation, right?
Yes, the frequency illusion is actually the exact mechanism by which junior radiologists develop expert search patterns. Once the brain knows what a subtle, life-threatening abnormality looks like, the salience network permanently flags it, drastically reducing the chance that the doctor will overlook it in the future.
It trains the neural net to spot the anomaly, but where does the sword cut the other way?
The vulnerability lies in confirmation bias, hijacking the diagnostic process. Imagine an attending physician attends a medical conference and learns about a newly discovered, highly complex, and rare autoimmune disorder. Their attention is entirely saturated by this new clinical data.
Okay.
The next week, a patient presents with a constellation of vague, overlapping symptoms: fatigue, joint pain, low-grade fever.
Oh, I see where this is going. The doctor's RAS is going to instantly highlight the specific symptoms that align with the rare disease they just learned about.
Exactly. The salience network aggressively pushes those matching symptoms to the forefront of the doctor's working memory. Meanwhile, confirmation bias actively downplays, rationalizes, or entirely ignores contradictory symptoms that point toward a much more statistically probable mundane illness.
So the physician risks misdiagnosing the patient simply because the rare disease was computationally prioritized by their recent exposure rather than by objective clinical probability.
Yes.
The diagnostic outcome is literally being dictated by the recency bias of the doctor's continuing education schedule.
It's a huge cognitive blind spot.
And this exact cognitive vulnerability applies directly to law enforcement and intelligence analysis, doesn't it? I mean, detectives are fundamentally pattern recognition specialists.
Absolutely. Criminal investigation relies on synthesizing disparate clues into a cohesive narrative. However, when the frequency illusion intersects with criminal justice, it frequently manifests as tunnel vision.
Which is terrifying.
It is. Suppose a detective receives a highly compelling, novel piece of intelligence, suggesting a specific individual is the prime suspect. The detective assigns massive valence to this individual.
The suspect is now at the top of the salience network's VIP list.
Right. From that moment forward, the detective's RAS acts as a heavily biased filter for all incoming evidence. It selectively highlights ambiguous clues, witness statements, and behavioral tics that confirm the suspect's guilt.
And they ignore the rest.
More dangerously, the brain will subconsciously filter out, minimize, or fail to process robust exculpatory evidence that contradicts the hypothesis. The detective is not engaging in malicious corruption. Their fundamental cognitive architecture is simply executing its biological mandate to construct and defend a cohesive pattern.
They are biologically trapped in a feedback loop of their own hypothesis.
Yes.
We've established that our brains engage in this filtering process entirely naturally, and it affects highly trained professionals unintentionally. But let me pivot to the commercial sector for a minute.
Okay.
Are corporate entities aware of this neurobiology? Are marketing firms and technology platforms intentionally exploiting the mechanics of the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon to manipulate behavior?
Oh, absolutely. It is not merely an exploitation. It is the foundational architecture of modern digital marketing. Our sources analyze the playbooks from marketing intelligence firms like Techent Labs.
And what do they say?
They do not view the frequency illusion as a psychological curiosity. They view it as a highly reliable, replicable mechanism for consumer acquisition.
Walk me through the mechanics of weaponizing a cognitive bias. How does a brand artificially induce the frequency illusion?
The strategy relies on intentional priming, followed by programmatic repetition. Phase 1 is breaching the RAS. A brand will deploy a highly vibrant, disruptive, or emotionally provocative advertisement.
Just to get your attention.
Right. The initial goal isn't necessarily to force a purchase immediately. The goal is simply to make your salience network assign a tiny fraction of value or curiosity to their product. They just need to get on the priority list.
So I see a bizarre, brightly colored pair of running shoes on my feed, and my brain tags it as novel.
Once the tag is established, Phase 2 initiates. Digital retargeting. Through sophisticated cookie tracking, device fingerprinting, and real-time bidding algorithms, the marketing firm ensures that this specific pair of shoes follows you across the internet.
It hunts you down.
Yeah. You see the banner ad on a news site on Wednesday, a sponsored post on Instagram on Thursday, and a pre-roll video on YouTube on Friday.
But the crucial element here is how my brain interprets that repetition. I don't consciously sit back and think, I am the target of a multi-channel programmatic ad campaign utilizing a $50 CPM.
No, your brain defaults to its evolutionary programming. Your selective attention and confirmation bias operate in unison to evaluate the data. The brain concludes, I am seeing these shoes everywhere in my environment. Therefore, these shoes must be experiencing massive, widespread cultural adoption.
It thinks it's a trend.
The algorithm artificially simulates ubiquity. This false perception of popularity leverages social proof, significantly inflating your baseline trust in the brand and drastically accelerating the likelihood of a conversion or purchase.
They are hacking my Paleolithic pattern recognition engine to sell me footwear.
They really are.
The commercial manipulation is unsettling, for sure, but a marketer convincing me to buy shoes is relatively benign compared to what happens when this cognitive machinery genuinely malfunctions. What occurs when the brain's threshold for detecting patterns loses its regulatory constraints?
That's when things get very difficult. When the delicate neurochemical balance governing the salience network is dysregulated, the results are deeply destabilizing. The breakdown of this system is heavily implicated in the pathology of severe psychological disorders, most prominently schizophrenia.
How does the mechanism of the frequency illusion interact with the symptomatology of schizophrenia?
Well, schizophrenia is frequently characterized by hyperdopaminergic states, particularly in the striatum. Recall that dopamine is the neurochemical signal for salience and importance.
Right, it tells you what matters.
In a healthy brain, dopamine is released when a genuine, biologically relevant pattern is detected. In a brain struggling with schizophrenia, dopamine is released erratically and inappropriately.
Meaning the system is misfiring.
Exactly. The salience network begins tagging completely random, irrelevant environmental stimuli. A passing red car, a specific sequence of numbers on a receipt, a stranger adjusting their hat as highly important and personally directed at the individual.
It's assigning massive emotional weight to pure static.
This phenomenon is termed aberrant salience. If an individual experiencing aberrant salience also falls subject to the frequency illusion, the cognitive loop becomes terrifying.
Because they keep seeing it everywhere.
Yes. If their brain tags the number 42 as highly salient, their RAS will suddenly highlight every instance of 42 in their environment. A healthy brain eventually employs the central executive network to logically dismiss the frequency as a statistical coincidence.
But a brain struggling with schizophrenia.
A brain in the grip of paranoia misinterprets this intense frequency as irrefutable empirical evidence of a targeted, orchestrated conspiracy.
The biological illusion provides the physical evidence that permanently locks the delusion into place. The brain is actively supplying data that tells them you are right, there is a pattern, and it is focused entirely on you.
Precisely. The cognitive architecture meant to ensure survival becomes the architect of their paranoia. This clinical extreme is part of a broader psychological continuum known as apophenia.
Define the parameters of apophenia for us.
Apophenia is defined as the universal human tendency to perceive meaningful connections, patterns, or causality in data that is entirely random or meaningless. It is the over-application of the brain's pattern recognition software, and a highly common, harmless subtype of apophenia is pareidolia.
Pareidolia, that is the visual variant, right? Like seeing the image of a face burned into a piece of toast or seeing a dragon in the shape of a cloud.
Exactly. Because human survival has historically depended on rapidly identifying faces to distinguish kin from potential enemies, our visual cortex, specifically the fusiform face area, is hypersensitized.
It's always looking for faces.
It will aggressively force the geometric interpretation of a face out of completely random shadows and textures. While seeing faces in clouds is benign, severe, non-clinical apophenia is the cognitive engine driving extreme conspiratorial thinking.
How so?
It is the mechanism that allows an individual to connect a random corporate logo, a geopolitical event, and an arbitrary sequence of numbers into a massive, hidden, and entirely fabricated grand narrative.
Which provides the perfect, albeit terrifying, transition to the modern digital landscape. If the human brain is biologically compelled to find patterns that confirm its pre-existing beliefs, what happens when billions of those brains are plugged into social media algorithms engineered specifically to cater to those exact biases?
You construct the ultimate, inescapable cognitive echo chamber. The recommendation algorithms driving social media platforms operate as an outsourced, weaponized extension of our own confirmation bias.
The algorithm is doing the confirmation for us.
Yes, it rapidly analyzes your engagement metrics, dwell time, click-through rates, likes, and instantly models your ideological biases, your political leanings, and your core anxieties.
And once it has that model, it curates your feed to ensure maximum retention.
It feeds you a constant, unending stream of content that perfectly mirrors and reinforces those pre-existing beliefs.
So my internal reticular activating system is only looking for data that validates my worldview, and the external algorithm is actively removing any data that challenges my worldview. It is a completely closed loop.
It is. And the behavioral consequence of this closed loop is a dangerous sociological phenomenon known as the false consensus effect.
The false consensus effect. Let's unpack that.
Because you are constantly subjected to a digitally manufactured frequency illusion, witnessing your specific opinions, fears, and political takes validated dozens of times an hour in your feed, Your brain intuitively calculates the statistics. It naturally, but entirely falsely, concludes that the vast majority of the human population agrees with your viewpoint.
Your localized simulation tells you that your perspective is the undisputed global consensus. You literally lose the cognitive capacity to understand that millions of people hold completely contradictory views because those people simply do not exist in the reality your feed has rendered for you.
And when you are inevitably forced to confront a contradictory fact, or you interact with an individual holding an opposing viewpoint in the physical world, it registers not as a difference of opinion, but as a malicious attack on reality itself.
Because it violates the rules of the simulation.
It feels deeply unnatural and highly threatening because your heavily curated reality has convinced your brain that your specific viewpoint is the absolute ubiquitous truth. This exact mechanism, the algorithmic exploitation of the salience network and the frequency illusion, is a primary biological driver of modern societal polarization.
It destroys the shared baseline of empirical facts required for a functioning society.
Unfortunately, yes.
So as we pull all these threads together today, we are left with a rather profound philosophical dilemma.
I think so too.
If our neural networks are constantly filtering out massive amounts of data, aggressively highlighting specific elements based on our emotional biases, and allowing algorithms to dictate our perception of ubiquity, what does that actually imply about the physical reality we are experiencing right now?
Well, when you synthesize the biological functions of the default mode network, the salience network, the RAS, and the profound power of the frequency illusion, it forces the adoption of a specific neurophilosophical framework. The human cognitive apparatus is not a passive recording device. Your eyes are not video cameras streaming an objective, empirical reality into your cortex.
If it's not a camera, what is the correct model?
The current dominant theory in neuroscience, often associated with predictive processing models, posits that the brain is an active, predictive simulation engine.
A simulation engine.
It does not construct reality from the bottom up, based purely on sensory input. It constructs a highly curated, deeply subjective model of the world from the top down, based entirely on what you have evolutionary prioritized, what you have learned, and what you expect to see. You are living inside a customized, personalized simulation generated entirely by your own neural networks.
I understand how that realization can feel somewhat nihilistic or terrifying to some. It implies a certain detachment from objective truth. But honestly, if you view it through a different lens, I think it is an incredibly empowering realization.
Oh, I agree completely.
Consider the implications for agency. If you passively allow your environment, your anxieties, or your algorithms to dictate your priorities, your reticular activating system will diligently filter the world to supply you with an endless stream of problems, threats, and outrage. You will literally see insurmountable obstacles everywhere you look.
You'll be trapped in it.
But if the system is programmable, you can actively prime your brain to search for entirely different patterns. If you consciously set your Salience Network's VIP list to prioritize gratitude, creative opportunity, or solutions to your current challenges, your innate biological frequency illusion will magically begin rendering those solutions in your environment. You are not merely a victim of your neural filters, you actually possess the executive capacity to reprogram them.
That is the ultimate actionable takeaway from the neuroscience of attention. You are biologically incapable of turning off the frequency illusion. Your brain must filter reality to survive. But you absolutely possess the conscious agency to dictate the frequency it tunes into.
You can change the channel.
You can use your central executive network to consciously determine the parameters of what your salience network searches for.
The power to determine the focus of the search algorithm. As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative concept to examine in your own life. Earlier, we discussed the analogy of radiologists reviewing X-rays.
Right.
The inherent assumption of an X-ray is that it provides a clear, binary, objective picture of pathology. A fractured bone is either physically present on the film or it is absent. But the neuroscience we've explored today proves that the perceptual X-ray machine of your mind is profoundly subjective. It possesses the alarming ability to only reveal what you have specifically instructed it to look for.
It's an active lens.
Exactly. So I leave you with this final thought. If your daily lived reality is nothing more than a highly curated feed generated by your reticular activating system, and you are only capable of perceiving the patterns you have been biologically primed to recognize, what massive, incredible, life-altering opportunities are currently hiding in plain sight right in front of you simply because your brain hasn't been programmed to notice them yet.
It forces you to fundamentally reconsider what you might be capable of seeing tomorrow, simply by making the conscious decision to begin looking for it today.
A brilliant reframe. A huge thank you to everyone supporting GL Deep Dives. Your support is what keeps this journey of discovery alive. If you're enjoying the show and finding value in these deep explorations into the mechanics of our world, please consider following and subscribing to stay connected and be part of what's coming next. We have some incredible mind-expanding topics on the horizon. See you on the next Deep Dive.